Welcome to the Homeschool Show from North Carolinians for Home Education. Our goal is to help you homeschool with confidence and joy. I'm your host, Matthew McDill, and we have as our co-host this week, Rhonda Marshall.
Hey, great to be here.
How's it going?
It's great.
Yeah, we're at the 20th Annual Alliance Homeschool Leaders Conference in St. Louis. It's a lot of fun. We get to be here with a bunch of other homeschool leaders, which is very exciting. We're learning a lot.
Learning so much.
And since we're here, we have a bunch of people we can bring on the show.
Wonderful.
So what do we have planned?
Well, we're going to, first of all, in our homeschool news, we're going to continue our series on the history of the modern homeschool movement in North Carolina. And then in our homeschool conversations, we have two great people we can't wait for you to hear from. Iew Pudewa, who is the founder and director of the Institute for Excellence in Writing. And we'll also talk with LaNisser James, who's a homeschool leader from Maryland and an HSLDA representative.
That's right. Awesome. That's great. Debbie Mason is our media director, and she and Spencer Mason have been on the board for a long time, like since the 80s. Yes. And so she actually knows and experienced the history of the modern homeschool movement in North Carolina. And last couple episodes, we've started a series on the little tidbits of history that she's been putting on Facebook. So we want to share a couple of more of those today, right? So this is called The Early Days of Homeschooling in North Carolina, the early 1980s. Homeschooling is now widely accepted in North Carolina. It was much different climate for home education in the early 1980s. Stories were told of homeschoolers living in rural areas who were able to stay in the shadows and exist without interference. However, those living in more urban areas did not have that advantage. During this time, George Quick of Stanley County, Bob Groves of Ashe County, and Larry Cockerham of Harnett County were arrested and booked for homeschooling.
That's like, oh.
Have you ever been arrested for homeschooling?
Not so far.
And many more were threatened. Larry Cockerham was a biology professor at Campbell University. Larry and George ended up being on the NCHE board. Others recollected that fear was rampant among home educators. During school hours, they drew the drapes, kept their children hidden indoors, and at the same time, homeschoolers realized that if they were going to have the freedom to educate their children, they needed to know how to influence the legislators. And a personal note from Debbie is that they moved to North Carolina in 1985, knowing this was happening to homeschoolers. She says, "Our oldest was 4. We were concerned, but figured that we had over 2 years of things to change before the compulsory attendance age of 7. We had a plan if the truancy officer knocked on our door." You know what their plan was? I would flee out the back door and take the kids to my mom's in Tennessee, and Spencer would go to jail. She said, we laugh at this now.
Throw your husband under the bus.
So tell us the next part here.
The next section is the formation of NCHE in 1984. News of Larry Cockerham's arrest for homeschooling his children ended up in the newspapers all statewide, and homeschoolers read about it in their local newspapers, and this caused homeschoolers statewide to come together. At that time, there were 3 groups of homeschoolers that were organizing and lobbying for homeschool rights. In the High Point, Winston-Salem group, there was a group in the greater Charlotte area, and another group in Hendersonville. So concerns about the arrests and the court rulings against homeschoolers prompted the families in the Charlotte group to form North Carolinians for Home Education, also known as NCHE.
That's right.
To encourage and organize homeschoolers across the state. And they began with organizational meetings in public libraries in the early 1984. And about that time, a couple of ladies from the Winston-Salem area were planning a meeting in Jamestown and working hard to locate as many homeschoolers as possible. So they contacted Focus on the Family and also the Moores to get the names and addresses of people from North Carolina who had corresponded with questions about homeschooling. So they sent out invitations, and that meeting, held at Solomon's Porch on March 31st, 1984, brought together groups of homeschoolers from all over the state under the banner of NCHE for the very first time.
The first conference.
Yeah, their first conference.
The first conference.
The first conference. This was the first statewide meeting under the NCHE name.
Nice.
And the meeting was conducted by Mary McLaurin, and she's a graduate education student at UNCG, and she was a strong homeschooling advocate, and she later actually worked for DNPE. So 3 mailings lists were developed based on geography. The families at the meeting didn't want a list with all their names that could fall into the hands of authorities. They were being careful, which was right.
Split up the list.
And there was a slight panic when at the meeting it was learned that a reporter from the Charlotte Observer was present.
Uh-oh.
But people thought they would be reported to the authorities, but it turned out that the reporter was actually there because he was considering homeschooling his family.
Yeah, you don't know about homeschooling. So at that meeting, a president, a vice president, a treasurer, and a secretary, along with 4 regional coordinators, were elected. The Greenhouse Report was created as the newsletter, and the first editors were designated. So now that's grown into Greenhouse Magazine.
Yeah.
The first issue was dated May 1984 and was sent to the 100 home educators who were brave enough to add their names to the NCHE mailing list. The Greenhouse Report was created to inform readers about legal actions against homeschoolers, strategies to reduce the chances of being arrested, parents' legal rights, and information on curriculum and legislation. Additionally, homeschoolers were encouraged to be politically involved, and NCHE printed brochures and educational packets for parents to use in explaining home education to a largely ignorant public. So here's another personal note from Debbie. We did not live in North Carolina when it was first formed. We moved to North Carolina in 1985 and joined NCHE the first week.
Of course you did.
And that's what everybody should do, though.
That's what they should do.
As soon as they hear about NCHE, they should immediately join.
That's right.
Because there were so few homeschoolers back then, pretty much all members were active members. And as they say, the rest is history.
I love this whole series.
Isn't it great?
It's so great.
It really gives an important context to why we're here, what's been done before, and how to think about moving forward. So
and also such an appreciation for those who've paved the way.
Yeah.
So grateful
Thanks
for
to
them.
the Masons and for these others who did that. Okay, we're here at the Alliance Conference, and Andrew Pudewa is here, who is the founder and director of IEW, Institute for Excellence in Writing. And I'm glad we could talk again.
Yeah,
good to see
it's fun. It's been a great week so far.
Yeah.
Nice to catch up.
So give us an update on just your experience over the last year or two of maybe the hot topics or some of the things that you enjoy talking about most to the homeschool parents.
I think obviously there's been lots of new people coming into the homeschool world far faster than the state organizations are able to
prepared for
serve them. So it's been interesting to see kind of how on the nonprofit state org side as well as kind of on the business side, we've worked to expand our ability to serve new parents who always have good questions, who aren't necessarily saying, man, I really want to homeschool.
That's different.
It's more kind of, there's just no option. And so that changes a little bit the way we try to help people. Okay, I understand this isn't, ideal for you, but how can we work to make it better?
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how do you start with a person like that? What are the first lines of foundational encouragement you give to those folks who are like, this is my last option?
Well, they usually come to us because of a curriculum need.
Yes.
So they'll say, I think my child really doesn't spell well or doesn't know grammar or can't write well. And usually they'll say behind. That's a typical thing for a new homeschooler coming out of a school system.
Yeah.
Is I'm worried that my children are behind. So initially my conversation is kind of like, behind whom? Like, what are you comparing this to?
Right.
And try to shift them into the idea that what you really want to do is compare your children with themselves.
Okay.
Like, okay, here's where she's at, here's where he's at. Now what are you going to do? And don't worry so much about other people's kids and what they can do. Even in a school, there's no such thing as not behind. Everybody's different.
Yeah.
And I think that is the most freeing thing that new homeschooling parents, when they get it, this idea that you do not have to compare your children based on age
Yeah.
to other people's children, then there's just this huge load that comes off of them. So that's one of the things
Right.
I like to kind of, in a polite and loving way, I like to challenge that idea
Right.
that, oh no, I'm somehow behind, and say, okay, well, clear the slate, and here's what we can do to help this child make progress in this area of, and we work mostly in language arts stuff.
Right. So let's stick with language arts there for a minute. And this is probably central to the philosophy and approach of IEW, but also just in general, parents who are trying to teach writing, let's offer a little bit of encouragement or advice for some of those most important aspects of teaching writing, especially when you haven't done it before.
Yeah, well, there's probably 3 general categories we could address, and of course, lots of kids are kind of in between the categories. But one category is, I have this kind of natural writer who knows, who likes writing,
Okay.
and I don't know how to help her make it better.
Okay.
I don't know how to help him focus that, or he'll write whatever he wants to write, but he sure doesn't want to write what I want him to do. And so there's that, how do you bridge into that, how do you get that same enthusiasm into the academic area of writing? That is probably the less common thing I hear about, because it's not really a big problem for most people. Like, my kid likes to write. Okay, we have other fish to fry here.
Yeah, right.
So more often we have someone who's got children that don't like to write.
Right.
And I think those fall into 2 categories in general. One would be they came out of a system, a school, a circumstance where they just never learned. And so they don't know how to do it. And, it's like anything. If you don't know how to do something, you won't like it.
It's frustrating.
It's like, nobody hates math. Nobody could hate math. Math is intrinsically beautiful. What you hate is not being able to do math, right?
I'll tell all the students that.
I mean, if I could do calculus, I'd like it.
Yeah.
The only reason I don't like it because I don't have a clue, right?
That's great.
So part of what we do is give people such a concrete step-by-step system to teach it, that our goal isn't to get your kid to like it. I don't even have a goal for a kid to stop hating it.
Okay.
My goal is for them to learn how to do it decently well.
Okay.
And then the side benefit is they stop hating it.
It's not
They
so bad.
start liking it.
It's not so bad, yeah.
And then the other general category are people whose children do have some type of neurological or emotional impediment.
Okay.
Right? So usually it's dyslexia, dysgraphia, or some kind of ADD or spectrum issue. And that's an area we've put a lot of work into in terms of resources and podcasts and blog posts and connections with experts in the area of learning. You'd call them learning disabilities or learning challenges or whatever. And usually those kids who don't like it or can't do it because of a neurological reason, most of the time it's because they get overwhelmed. The complexity of the process is just too much for them to deal with.
Right.
And again, by taking the complexity of writing and breaking it into a very small step-by-step process usually helps that a great deal. And maybe some other assistances are needed, very dyslexic kids. And also on that same side is to help relieve the fear. Oh no, I have an 8-year-old. He doesn't like to read. He can't write anything. What do I do? He's 8 years old. As though this is the end of the world.
Right.
You and I know that kids are all different. They grow up at different speeds. They have different brains and bodies and souls. And there's lots of people who didn't read or write when they're 8 years old. And then they grew up and they're just fine. They have PhDs or they're, missionaries in Zambia, So I think disconnecting parents from that fear they have that their child can't do some academic thing from the bigger picture of who this child is in God's eyes, who this child is going to become and what they're going to do in the world. That's way more important to think about than whether they can read at 8 years old or not.
Right. Yeah, that's so great. Every way we can help parents and students not shut down and not be afraid, and those are excellent pieces of advice. We're looking forward to having you at the Thrive Conference.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and say, mark your calendar for May 25, 26, and 27 of 2023. And in the meantime, how can they find Iew Resources?
IEW stands for Institute for Excellence in Writing.
Yes, thank you.
But we broke down and went ahead and invested in a 3-letter domain name, which we're not cheap.
Okay.
But it's IEW.com. And
Perfect.
it was worth it.
Yeah.
Then people can remember.
Absolutely.
And I also have a podcast, the Arts of Language podcast, or just search my name, Andrew Pudewa.
Great.
And we have lots of menu, very some kinds specific to things like special needs or back to homeschool. We do every 10 episodes, we do a homeschool 101.
Oh,
and
nice.
so
That's a good
I
idea.
sometimes interview other people
Okay.
that I know who have awesome ideas to offer.
That's nice.
So I think that one of the things we see this incredible opportunity to reach a lot of people through technology, as we are doing now, which is great. But I also am always reminded of the value of being together, face to face, person to person,
Right.
meet new people, have a conversation you never would have had just by listening to somebody's podcast or thinking that you can get it all online.
Right.
And so as people are, kind of thinking ahead, I don't know a single person who ever said to me, well, I went to that homeschool convention and I sure wish I hadn't.
What a waste of time.
I've never heard anyone say it.
That's
I have
great.
heard hundreds of times people, I wasn't going to come, but I'm so glad I did.
Right.
Because there's just
great.
that real spirit to spirit dialoguing.
Right.
And as the world pushes us more into the metaverse
Right.
kind of thinking about everything, my good friend Andrew Kuhn, who lives in your state, he was writing an email that I was copied on. And he says, these things are neither virtual nor digital. They're unreal. So yeah, we have to do it. But if we could do this together, wouldn't that be so much better for?
Absolutely.
And he's always thinking for our soul.
That's right.
So I tend
Absolutely.
to agree with that.
Well, thanks for talking with me.
Sure, pleasure.
Look
You guys
forward to
keep
seeing
up
you.
the good work. And
Thank you.
I've always enjoyed every trip I've ever taken to North Carolina. It's
Well,
a
that's great.
state.
We're really excited for the conference and for you to be there.
All right.
Thanks. All right.
This is my first interview ever, so have mercy upon me.
She's been my co-host for a while, but she hasn't done it.
I haven't done
Okay.
interviews. You ready? Okay, let's get started. Well, we're back, and here is LaNisser James. She is a homeschool leader in Maryland and also an HSLDA representative. Tell us about what you do with HSLDA, LaNisser.
Thank you, Rhonda. So I am a high school educational consultant, and I'm also the outreach coordinator for HSLDA.
Awesome. Well, we're so glad to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. So what would you say is your favorite piece of advice, or a few pieces of advice, to give to new homeschoolers?
New homeschoolers, wow. The advice I give to new homeschoolers is spend some time to get your why clear. I think when homeschoolers begin the journey, they're running from a problem. And so when you're running from a problem, you're jumping right in to solve that problem. Maybe Johnny's had problems with math, and so you're all focused on math. Or, Johnny had behavior issues and you're focused on his behavior. Or you feel like you can do better academically and you're after the academics, but you forget to clarify your why. Like, why are you homeschooling? And I think that is a game changer when you approach homeschooling, especially for the long haul.
If you want to do it for the long haul, it's so critical.
Yes.
So what do you see new homeschoolers struggling with more, as you have experience with counseling them?
Yes, so I've been homeschooling now about 17 years, and I have 7 of my own children, and have the pleasure of connecting with homeschoolers. I think they're struggling with modeling homeschooling from what they think homeschooling is. And so they're struggling with what it should look like.
That's really true.
And it looks like whatever you want it to look like.
It can be different for every
It
family.
can be different. And I think people are uncomfortable with that. Like, I know when we first started homeschooling, my husband is in law enforcement. And so when we first started, he was working a 3 to 11. And so our evenings were kind of messed up because he was not home.
Right.
And during the day, when the kids were home, he was at work. So one of the first things we did was we decided, what did our homeschool need to look like? And I think that that's important, when you approach homeschooling, to really get clear on those kind of things.
And it sounds like you were willing to go outside the box of what traditional school hours were, right? How did that work in your family?
Well, once we released the fact that school doesn't have to happen from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., I mean, who said that, right?
Right, exactly.
And also selling the family on it, because I think the family feels awkward. If you have a team, my specialty is working with teens.
Yes.
So if you have a teen, sometimes they feel awkward when mom's not, they hear the school bus going down the street.
But we're not doing school.
And we're not doing school, right?
All right.
But guess what? There are life skills that are important. There's character building, there are biblical aspects that you need that's more important than math. And I think, really that's what's going on with homeschoolers, particularly when they're new. They're a little bit awkward in that process of fixing some things that maybe the school was never even going to address.
Right. And some of us even long-term homeschoolers, sometimes we have struggles. Can you speak to what you've seen as those and any solutions that you found?
Yes. I think often for long-term homeschoolers, we forget to begin with the end in mind. We've heard that term before.
Yes.
And so we're busy homeschooling and we forget to think about post-homeschooling.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, this great student, this, full of godly character, has no direction at the end.
Right.
Because you never talked about it.
You need to have intentionality. Yeah, I hear you saying that. Yeah. Anything else that you think of?
Well, when we think about African American homeschooling, someone said something to me that I thought was profound. They said, African Americans are running at least 30 years behind.
Really?
30 years behind. So when people who are minority or underserved come on the scene, we have to be mindful of that.
Right.
So that, they need more education. If not, they become a threat to homeschooling because they come in and they bring a different mindset in, but they're running 30 years behind.
Right, because hasn't been as many that have taken on the mantle of homeschooling until more recently, which it's really grown a lot, which is wonderful. So for your brothers and sisters that are taking this on, what advice would you give them as they're stepping into the homeschool room, as more and more of them are, which is so exciting?
Yes, mentors. They need mentors.
Oh, yeah.
They need mentors. They need people who look like them, who will model them, who will give them a vision for the future. Because they may have parents and grandparents, just like my mother. When I first started homeschooling, we were spending $20,000 in Christian education.
Wow.
And she thought, you're homeschooling my grandkids. You mean they're not going to college? So now I had to convince my husband, the kids, and my mom.
That's big. It's big responsibility.
Yeah. So you really need mentors of people who it's been successful for them. It's worked for them. They're happy in homeschooling so that they can begin to model and get their why clear.
Good. Oh, man. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today, LaNisser. We really appreciate all your advice and wisdom.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Those are some great conversations.
They really
Isn't it
were.
fun?
I loved it. It was so fun. But I was nervous, but it was great.
It was
great.
good.
But thanks so much for joining us this week. We so appreciate you taking the time to spend it with us. And we would absolutely love hearing from you. So please send us your feedback and ideas for content. Send it to the Homeschool Show at nche.com. We'd love to do that. And also, please help us get the word out about our podcast by liking and subscribing and rating and leaving a review. Whatever you can do, share it on all the different platforms for podcasts and also on YouTube. To learn how to subscribe to our show as a podcast and or on YouTube, visit nche.com/The Homeschool Show.
That's great. And until next week, continue to homeschool with confidence and joy.